Hello, my name is Daija Yisrael, and this semester I used my Tenenbaum Scholar independent research to conduct research on the Haitian Revolution as a revolutionary praxis. I spent most of my time on the island really trying to visualize life during the onset of imperialism as the consumer revolution was just taking off on the island that was pertinent to all of the social and economic advancements of the New World. I learned that Haiti was a part of a co-influencing relationship between France and Saint-Domingue, which is colonial Haiti, and I learned that social mobility was redefined during this period. Going into the semester, I knew that I wanted to research power as a network, as something not only bestowed upon someone or many someones, but something that lives in the individual. In my anthropological, political science, and historical education, I've studied instances where individuals address authority with a specific goal. And in these interactions, as approached by all disciplines, there lies the question of which party truly holds power. Is it the elected official or those who elected them? Or is it the interaction itself that creates the power, the dual recognition of one another's role in society? I've never found a satisfying answer to this question, perhaps because it depends upon the case. So I decided to search for an answer in what I felt was one of, if not the biggest transfer of power in history, the Haitian Revolution. Going into the semester, I was curious about race and how it meant different things to different cultures and nations. This led to my research question. How does this difference in perspective around race impact the African diaspora and government? I was curious to see the cultural and political developments of these implications. And so I decided to track how the political and social power developed in and around Haiti from French colonialism through independence and to today. And I discovered that they revealed different understandings of how race impacted the unity and diffusion of the African diaspora and governing tactics in the slave plantation economy. I started my research before the semester began, reading about the history of plantations in New Orleans, the tourism industry of plantations in Louisiana, and how Black absence in the industry and physical spaces indicate the longevity of white power. Next, I dove into literature regarding historicity or historical authenticity to try to understand why such an important and complex event, such as the Haitian Revolution, is presented as simply a successful slave revolt in American history education. With a better understanding of why this narrative is widely overlooked, I read two accounts of the Haitian Revolution. The Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James is a Marxist account that focuses more on the economic developments of the island and attributes the success of the revolution to the military and economic power of Toussaint Louverture. Laurent Dubois's account, The Avengers of the New World, presents the revolution as a pillar of democracy and attributes our global understanding of human rights today to the developments in this revolution. Each account centralized different developments, so I decided to make a timeline, which is what is displayed here. After discussing the differences between these accounts and how they affect the historicity, I knew I wanted to dig deeper into life right before the revolution. So that is why I have the onset, the years before, and then starting with the Haitian or the French Revolution in 1789, things really begin to pick up, and really all the way until 1799. That decade's really important. So that's what I focused on in this portion of the timeline that I'm presenting to you all today. From this point on in my research, I focused on specific aspects of the developments that led to the revolution, as presented in the timeline. Initially, I created the timeline to keep track of the battles that C.L.R. James presented in the Black Jacobins because I had no clue how complex of an event the revolution was. But as I read Du Bois's account, and considered my own personal knowledge of French history, I realized that the timeline would be really helpful in organizing my own analysis as separate from these big major accounts. And yeah, it was really helpful. It served as a great organization tool in separating all of these analyses. My main finding in this process was that the complex state of colonial Haiti pre-revolution created a strong sense of community and identity among certain populations that carried the country through the turmoil of the revolution. And when I say a strong sense of community and identity in certain populations, I refer to that interaction, that development, as the source of soft power. This passion for liberty and reliance on community diffused across the Caribbean Atlantic, including to New Orleans. And I traced all of that through my research. To give a more detailed explanation of these communities, Saint-Domingue was split into a bunch of different regions with different geographies, different states of industrialization, and Le Cap, which was the main city at the time, was equivalent to Philadelphia in this day, Paris in this day. So just to give you an idea of the kind of the culture that we're living in right now, very vibrant, lots of people, lots of technological advances. The sugar production for basically the entire world was centralized on this island, so extremely powerful. And amongst all of this, there were slaves. In 1790, Saint-Domingue accounted for 10% of the volume of the transatlantic slave trade. So a bunch of different African cultures. Then, as time went on, free people of color grew their own population. You had a biracial population that has a really interesting intersection with economy that created a whole racial and economic class. There are Creoles, white planters who live on the island, then French colonials who kind of travel back and forth, delivering messages from the National Assembly, which is just being formed right at this time. So a lot of strong identity developments happening here. The bigger implication of this revolutionary period was the advancement of socioeconomic mobility and how tools like education are used to manipulate this advancement. The trauma of identity politics on the island resulted in psychological barriers, such as racism, that continue to impact society today. And I should correct myself and say not just psychological, but also institutional barriers. And racism is, again, a perfect example. I know that without all of the details, it's hard to kind of follow my argument. It may be hard to follow my argument, but I wrote a paper for my French class. During my French time of research, I focused more on the impact of the revolution on a global scale. So that focuses a lot more on the global economy, how Europe was impacted when the revolts started in 1791, abolitionist movements, and so on and so forth. I will give everyone access to that paper, as well as it focuses on more detailed accounts of racial development, how race was thought of at the time, and how race and class and education interact to provide different sources of soft power throughout the development of the revolution, and how I believe that is the reason why this was successful. The revolution was successful. At this point, or at the ending point of my research, I wanted to loop back to New Orleans and think about how these cultures that slaves or free people of color, slaves, and anyone on the island really brought with them as they found their new homes in the Caribbean Atlantic. And because New Orleans was the most prosperous city in 1803 at in 1803, a lot of people chose to go to New Orleans. It was a place for great opportunity. So I visited a few museums downtown, and I've noticed throughout my whole research of colonialism, really in general, this focus or different accounts of traditional religious ceremonies, many of which are labeled as voodoo, even though they're practiced by different cultures. And so, one account I noticed was this combination of two traditional African religious practices, one that was called voodoo, and another that had more of, I guess, Spanish implications from the Spanish controlled side of the Hispaniola island that Saint Domingue, um, the Spanish controlled side, shared. And this account specifically refers to a procession that happens after a funeral with bright colors and bright music and dancing. And that reminded me of the second line. And since then, I've been trying to figure out how this traditional religion has been commercialized so well and also dehumanized to a degree in New Orleans culture and where that came from. My hunch is capitalism, but I'm going off on a tangent now. I really enjoyed this research process. I'm very grateful to my mentor, Professor Guadalupe Garcia, for teaching me how to be a historian, even though I'm a political scientist and anthropologist. I'm grateful to the Tenenbaum Scholars Program for providing me the funding, time, and credits to dive into something that I genuinely adore. Um, and I'll just give a quick overview of this timeline. It'll be available on the website, I presume. And yes, that's all I have. Thank you.